really good idea of, hey, when you have 4 feet of snow on top of this thing, blah, 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 what's, and give you like the real empirical, having run the simulation stuff. And that's how you'd really do that. Would be to run it in SolidWorks, and then do a finite element analysis on all the elements on all the beams and everything.
I would have to say that even if you did that, it would be a little. It would still be kind of like. I mean, it's a model.
Yes.
And the reality is that each of the logs is a little bit different and has a little bit of a different story. Correct. And then it's like, okay, is that one a tamarack? Is that one a pine? Is that one a fir? And, those kinds of things. And then how dry is it? How old is it? Yes. How pithy is it? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like,
we would take and we would model it based upon sort of the weekend.
Sorry to halt the discussion. We are live. Welcome everybody to Permaculture Smackdown. My name is Josiah Wallingford, and always my co-host, Paul Wheaton.
Yes! Yeah, I'm here! I made it!
Yay. And we have special guest with us today, Mr. Allan Booker. Allan is a systems engineer, and he's been doing that for...
He's cutting out again.
Specializing in digital telecommunications, large-scale computer systems, from Auburn University, correct? That's where you graduated?
Yes, graduated from Auburn.
With electrical engineering. So I guess my first question for you, Allan, is okay, electrical engineer. Why is this relevant to permaculture? Why are you a permaculture design instructor with the electrical engineering background?
Yeah, that's I think one of the things when people ask me that, the first thing that pops up is there's a sort of like a mindset that for engineers, and they're sort of like problem solvers and analytical people, And I grew up sort of outdoors in nature, came up in that time when we were out running around playing in the streams and the creeks and everything. And I had a couple of aunts that were really great at helping me understand the value of the natural world. And, so I go to engineering school because I got that problem solving thing going on. And I get out, I start working, and as I continue to do that for a while, I kind of get to the point where I'm looking around and going, wow, we're making a mess. From an engineering perspective, looking at all of the things that we are doing as engineers, building all of this infrastructure, it's like, this is a mess, and it's not going to end well, and we're going to have to do something different eventually, or we're not going to be happy with the outcome. As a matter of fact, a lot of the outcomes we've got already are not that great. And so I decided, hey, I like to solve problems. How are we going to solve this thing, right? And so the way I looked at it is, who's already showing solutions? Who can I go and see that they've got stuff happening that makes sense from an engineering perspective, from a design perspective, that I can go walk on their sites, see things happening that in different biomes all over the world, and see that it works. And so I spent some time looking at that, and really the permaculture designers were some of the only people that met that criteria. And so I was like, well, that's pretty interesting. Maybe I should study what they're doing. So I grabbed a copy of Mollison's Designer's Manual and sat down and went through it. And I was like, there's a lot in here that makes a lot of sense, and here I am.
I like hearing that. So that's one thing I really enjoy working with engineers of all. There's lots of different engineering fields, but usually with most of those fields, those engineers have a way of thinking that a lot of people don't, and that's that I think is the most exciting part about being instructed by a systems engineer or an engineer in general, is that you get a glimpse and some training on how to think this way. And Paul, I know you've got some experience with some engineering kind of stuff, and I'm sure you're wanting to key in here.
My path to permaculture was different from Allan's. In fact, I had a product that I had made, software that I had made, and it was doing really well, but I couldn't as much as all the people really needed me to go and work on that, I just couldn't seem to do it because I was so hyper-focused on my garden. And I was obsessing, and that was the summer I read 100 gardening books. And my obsession just grew and grew and grew over the years. And then somebody introduced me to the word permaculture. So my path was a very different path. Rather than thinking of it from the perspective of like, I'm going to save the world. Instead, it was more like, I'm going to grow myself some food. And it just grew and grew and grew and grew. Then later came the whole thing after I learned the word permaculture, where it's like, as you consider each of the world's problems and you think it through, you really, really care, and you really, really think it through, and you really think of what is the solution to that problem, it seems like every problem you tried to think of, the answer ends up at homesteading and permaculture.
Which brings me to, Allan is teaching a permaculture designer's course. And that course is going to be at Wheaton Labs. Thank you, Paul. And so I'm excited about this, but I want to get other people excited about it too. So we kind of know what you're going to get from Allan, and in that you're getting an engineer. You're getting an actual engineer that's going to teach you some great things, and we're going to go into some very interesting topics here in just a moment. But there's like almost 100 PDCs in America alone every year. There's online PDCs. Why go to this PDC?
Yes, I think one of the things that Paul and I talked about as we started talking about doing this PDC was that we wanted to, and the reason that I think Paul specifically asked me to come and do this, Homesteaders PDC there at Wheaton Labs was there are a lot of different approaches to teaching a PDC, and some of them are not very rigorous in terms of like the science and so forth, and then there are others that are a little more meaty. And so what Paul was looking for was something that would be really meaty, that was that went deep into the design side of things and deep into understanding the science and the engineering that is really practical to make things work. And I had, one of my last PDCs, I had a young lady who had her bachelor's degree in Earth System Sciences, and she took my PDC, and at the end she told me, she said, I learned more in your PDC that was practical and usable than in my entire undergraduate degree in Earth System Sciences. And I think the reason that is that permaculture design really pushes in on what we would think about as what I would call a complex adaptive system. And that's one of the big differences between permaculture as a design approach and a lot of the other design approaches that I've seen, even in engineering. A lot of them try to work with systems and make them simple and make them more linear and make them behave the way we would like them to behave. Whereas permaculture actually embraces the complexity of natural ecosystems, and it uses that to its own advantage. And so I think what we're going to try to get into here that's going to make it a lot different is take a really meaty, technical, sciencey look at things, but through the lens of picking out this really important stuff that's going to be high value and putting it together to help students really come away with critical insights into the physics and the chemistry and the biology, the stuff they're looking at, and the dynamics of how that works in a complex ecosystem. Because I'll tell you, designing a homestead and a farm and a garden is actually got more variables and more complexity to it than a lot of the stuff we do in the engineering labs, because it's working with natural ecosystems and complexity and nonlinearity. And so I really love synthesizing that, my engineering background, with understanding how to work with these natural ecosystems in ways that allow us to do magic. I think that's what's going to make this a little different.
And it's good to hear you talk about the homestead, because a lot of permaculture design courses are focused on this is how you become a consultant. So you can go out to public lands or your own like piece of land, or some other maybe couple 100-acre pieces of land, whatever, and consult them on what to do with their property, maybe do some earthworks, things like that. But you're talking about a homestead. This is your I felt a focus on the homestead, and that seems to be what it is. If I look at the PDC page at richsoil.com, there's a pdc.jsp page, and it's called, this PDC is called the Permaculture Design Course for Homesteaders. And that's good to hear. So is there something that's more specific, or how does this separate from a regular PDC? Where's the homesteading aspects?
Right. So this is another one of the things that Paul really wanted to focus in on for this particular PDC, because he's got a lot of folks that have been excited about something that concentrated on that. And what I would say is, if you want to become a consultant, then sure, come and join us. You'll get everything you need. And we're definitely going to cover the stuff that you would, the stuff for urban permaculture and broadacre permaculture. We're going to talk about that some, but because we are taking and focusing in on homesteaders for this particular PDC, what I'm going to be doing is taking the curriculum that I've been teaching here and sort of really amping up the emphasis on the homesteading skills. And we're going to bring in a lot of really fantastic guest instructors who have a lot of hands-on experience in these different areas of homesteading. And so it really is being designed. I'm helping coordinate all of that as the head instructor, all the different guest instructors and so forth. We're putting together something that if somebody's interested in being a homesteader and doing that, this is going to like really play to that. And it's not going to exclude anybody else, but we're going to try to make something that if you want to be a homesteader, this is going to be like the thing you want to be at. Okay,
excellent. Yeah, and I've had the privilege of being in kind of the back end discussions with a lot of these guest instructors, and it's really an exciting lineup. I'm excited to get these guys on.
Let me just mention with that I'm really excited to have Tara as my my guest as the associate instructor. So she and I are going to be tag teaming a lot of it. And the exciting thing is she has a really great background in the sciences and ecology and biology. So you're going to get, you're going to get both the male perspective and the female perspective. I think it's really important that you have both of those voices and so forth. But you're going to get an engineer and my side of it, and you're going to get Tara coming in from the sciences and the ecology and a lot of hands-on work in desert ecosystems and other things like that. So in getting to know Tara and talk to her about what we're going to be doing, I've gotten to be really excited that she's going to be a part of the team. And I think that's going to be a really cool tag team for the two main instructors for the class. And then a lot of really great guest instructors are going to come in and add to that.
Absolutely. And so for those that don't know, he's talking about Tara Ray, who she runs Tara Ray Designs out of Boulder. And so she's also part of the Boulder PDC. Actually, she might run Boulder PDC. But yeah, she's excellent. I'm excited to learn from her as well. Paul, how did you guys meet? I want to get Paul's perspective here a little bit. Why Allan? Where did you guys meet?
We met at a Sepultura event a few years ago over in Bozeman. I kind of feel like as I walk the path that I walk, it's rare to meet somebody who speaks what I call the language of the engineers. And I've heard some people say, you can't always be right. And I know that is a person who does not speak the language of the engineers, because you can always be right. If I say, I think the sky is green, that is a correct statement. Nobody can refute it unless they want to make the claim that they can read my mind. Speaking in these absolutes and this clarity and being able to insert probability into whatever it is that you say so that every statement you say is undisputably true is what I call the language of the engineers. And in the world of engineering, it is rare to find somebody who speaks this language. And then I ran into Allan, and instantly it was like, I could tell Allan speaks the language of the engineers. And it's like every time Allan and I have gotten together since then, it's this kind of thing where you're not having to dance around people's spin that they normally have been taught to use, oh, that's just a figure of speech. Exaggeration. It's just a figure of speech. And it's like in the language of the engineers, that kind of exaggeration is not allowed, and you don't do it. That's called a form of lying. And so, no, it's not cool. So for this PDC, there's that. So every time I sit down and talk to Allan, it's like he and I exchange information 10 times faster than when I try to talk to anybody else, including you, Josiah. It's because he understands the language of the engineers. And it's like, we'll qualify every statement so that I'll know exactly what he says. He knows exactly what I say. The rate of exchange is tremendous. At the same time, I remember the 2012 PDC where I met you, Josiah. And it's like, the sentiment that I got tons of feedback from that is that this is a PDC for dummies. And it's like a lot of PDCs are geared that way. Most PDCs are kind of geared that way. The lowest common denominator. It's like if you just pick up the designer's manual and read it, you'll know more than what's covered in the PDC. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like a little bit of like, so I was getting a lot of people that were coming to me, and I wasn't teaching the PDC. I was just there as a guest instructor. A lot of people were telling me, like, I feel like I'm wasting 2 weeks of my life being here. I mean, okay, I'll get the certificate when I'm done, and there's other things that are nice, but I'm not getting what I was hoping to get. And all these people that were coming and talking to me were pod people that were, by the way, I want to hear from the people that are on the chat thing. If you guys listen to this podcast I just put out about the landrace seeds, I think that's one of my all-time best podcasts. And I kind of feel like that is so permaculture, this landrace seed thing. But the key is it's the pod people that were at that PDC, and they were frustrated that it was so simplistic. So what we've done is for this year, we've been planning it for over a year now, is we've got the peasant PDC, which is your more conventional PDC, but it's spread out over a month, and it's made really, really cheap. So it's very easy for noobs to get in on. A lot of hands-on stuff. And then if those people wanted to, they could take a second PDC at Wheaton Labs, which immediately follows the first one, which is going to be Allan's PDC, which we've billed it as. Not only is it a homesteader's PDC, but we've kind of talked about this is the one for scientists and engineers. So if you appreciate the language of the engineer, then this is going to be the one for you. So it's going to be taught by an engineer and a scientist. And so it's going to be heavy. It's going to be tech heavy. It's going to have a good clip. It will not cater to the lowest common denominator. If people want a simpler, easy to digest PDC, that's going to be the peasant PDC. If people are like already at level 4 or 5, and they want something where it's like it's gonna be 2 weeks out of their very busy professional life, I think that the Homesteaders PDC for scientists and engineers is going to be look at Allan bobbing his head.
But I do want to say we are going to have a lot of fun. But okay, for scientists and engineers who want to have a lot of fun, because you're learning best when you have fun.
Okay, I want to point out that scientists and engineers are not usually your go-to guy for parties and fun.
But that's one thing that I'm really excited about the PDC is that it's something where you're getting applicable knowledge instead of just the wishy-washy. There's a lot of PDCs out there.
Oh no, he's cutting out again.
For some
Your internet sucks. All right, Josiah, we just lost most of what you said due to your crappy internet.
I was just saying that a lot of PDCs out there, you're going and you're learning about political correctness instead of applicable knowledge that you can use in your field, and that's why I'm excited about it.
Okay. Maybe we'll have to hire somebody to be our to orchestrate the fun, Allan. I mean, I'm sure between you and I, we come up with things we think are cool. But hey, maybe if it is scientists and engineers, they'll think it's cool too. Yeah. I'm not sure what exactly that might be. Probably like taking things apart. Hey, let's look at this thing. Let's take it apart. Stop taking my tools apart.
Ben says engineers brew the best beer.
That's true. That is true.
Ben also says that my podcast was a really good one. So, all right. So there you go. I met Allan in Bozeman a few years ago, and it was immediate click. And at the same time, Allan, at the time, weren't you studying to be PRI certified?
Yes, yeah, and I haven't finished that paperwork just because they've changed around some of the things and so on. Yeah. I went off and I've taught a number of PDCs, and I've have gone on and like taken and gone past a lot of their requirements and deepened the requirements for what I want to do. And I run now the Eldenbridge Institute here, where I'm in Huntsville, Alabama, and we have a very technical audience here. Huntsville is a very technical town, a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers. And so that's where I've developed the curriculum that I'm using right now. And it does meet all the requirements for the PRI. For people who are interested, I pretty much check all the boxes for PINA if you're interested in that as well, although I haven't gone off and done all the paperwork to get that. But then we go and bring in a lot of science and engineering that's the new stuff that's come out since the designer's manual. So there's a lot of that integrated into this curriculum as well.
Speaking of Alabama, Ben's got a question for us. Ben asks, Allan, what's the state of permaculture in Alabama? Does it go over better than other environmentalist approaches in the South?
There's actually very little permaculture in Alabama right now, except for what we're doing. I know of about 8 people in Alabama that have PDCs, and 6 of them are on my team. And they're all scientists and engineers, except for one who is basically going into the homesteading side, but he's got a really scientific mindset to him. But what's been interesting is that it's been hard here to get people to jump on board from a really, I guess we'll call it, if you come at it from a environmentalist standpoint, that's been kind of harder. But when you talk to people about the problems that they can actually see and about how we're going to solve those problems, then all of a sudden they really start to get more interested. So that has been very successful, and that's brought in a lot of the people that I'm working with, some PhDs and so on and so forth, that have become really interested in what we're doing because they can see they come out to a different door. They come out to that door of, we see problems and we're trying to figure out what in the heck we're going to do about it. Yeah.
All right, excellent. Now, Allan, you're working on a book, and I think this is the core discussion. This is where I'm going to get some really good education. I think our listeners are too, and Paul will have a lot of things to argue about for you. So
always.
So what's going on with this book? What's kind of in the details?
So yeah, we were joking beforehand. I've actually got several books in the work, just like Paul, but the one that I'm playing with right now, I got to think, which one do I prioritize? What do I do first? And I had done a course for regenerative engineering a while back and talked about what I would, resilient design. So I had a bunch of people who were engineering students and engineers and scientists, and we were talking about, how do you design resilient stuff? Because this is, it's a topic that's popping up. And so I started writing out, after my 30 years in engineering and designing systems of all kinds of different scales and so forth, I started kind of trying to write out my rules of for the students that were like literally college students going in engineering who want to do this for a profession. That encapsulated a lot of the knowledge that engineers that have been in the field and doing this and got their fingers burned by making mistakes. So sort of, what have we learned from all of that? And I wrote up a bunch of rules and we started working with it. And over time, as I would think about things, I kept on adding to the rules. And they pretty much now stabilize at 26 rules. And so the rules, and you could argue we could add some or consolidate some, but the way I worked them out, they're about 26. And so I said, well, what we need to do is we need to put this out and synthesize a lot of the knowledge from permaculture design and best practices from engineering into a book and call it 26 Rules for Designing Resilient Systems. And one of the very first things I say towards the beginning of it is that, in my mind, if you're going to be resilient over the long term, you also have to be regenerative. And that's a discussion as to why that's the case. But I don't see how you do non-regenerative design that's going to be resilient over the long term. And so it kind of works out to be a book that talks about what are these engineering best practices, but even below that, what is it that determines what is good and bad design? And when you start looking at that, you realize things pop up at you, like if you're going to do design, there's an ethic to every design you do, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And it turns out that when you look at permaculture, one of the brilliant things that Mollison did was acknowledge that every design you do makes ethical decisions and that we should be explicit about the ethics we use, right? So I also have in here Rule 0, and Rule 0 is the underlying rule that says if you're going to design something that's going to be a good design and it's going to be resilient and regenerative over time, that we have to acknowledge the ethics of what we're doing, right? And there's several other elements to the underlying approach we have to take to design in order for the other 26 rules to actually work out and give us a good end result. So that's kind of the outline of the book. The first part of it says, here's what a system is. We're designing the system. We're designing a resilient system. Well, what in the heck is a resilient system in the first place? Rule 0 says there's some underlying things we have to consider in order to develop a ethical and practical economic system that serves the people that it says it's going to serve. And then here's 26 practical rules that go into, as you're designing it, here are things that you need to look out for, rules of thumb and so forth. And a couple of them are basically things that if you've taken the PDC, you recognize as some of Mollison's design principles because, well, there are some things there that are pretty core. And that's what the book is, sort of in a nutshell, is looking at that. So that's sort of what the book is.
And so each rule takes into consideration the 3 principles of design, or the principles of design from Mollison.
So I guess what I would say is that, to me, the ethics are in Rule 0, and they underlie every rule. In other words, as you apply the rule, you have to apply that there are these underlying Rule 0 things that you have to do. If I pull up my outline real quickly, which I'll do, I can basically pull down here and give you Rule 0. There's a lot to unpack. I'm not going to have to be able to unpack all of it in today, remember, this is still in works, so I'm still peer reviewing this. We'll probably haul off and end up tweaking these rules, right? But it says, use holistic design methods that engage the whole person abilities of the designers in an ongoing process of creating ethical, economic, and biocompatible systems that support the ability of the people they serve to be happy and healthy. So a lot in there. But you hear the creating ethical, economic, and biocompatible systems. And so that ethical part is that, to me, if you're going to be doing any kind of design, you need to be explicit about your ethics. Otherwise, you're missing sort of the compass of making certain kinds of decisions. Otherwise, if you're not acknowledging your ethics, you're probably using a set of ethics that are implicit and you haven't examined. So to me, as we apply every rule, then underlying the application of that rule is, what are we trying to do here, right? What are we actually trying to achieve? because it's really easy to get into the middle of designing a bunch of stuff and get excited with all of the logistics of it and the creativity of designing it and so forth, and maybe lose the underlying purpose and the underlying ethics and so forth of it. And
I love hearing the economics, because it's something that a lot of wishy-washy stuff doesn't really cover, and I'd love to hear the engineer's perspective. So how does economics fit into permaculture?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things that I like to point out is that, you know, we're designing these things in the real world, and therefore, if we do not create something that is economically viable, it's not going to be resilient. It's not going to last over the long term, right? You know, yeah, you might be able to do something as a pet project, but if it's always running at a loss, how resilient are you going to be? But one of the things I like to point out is that the single-dimensional economic analysis of monetary flow as being the only economic dimension also is a failed metric. In other words, if when you're looking at things, you say money flow is the only economic dimension that we're going to think about, then we know from empirical evidence that that by itself fails to give good outcomes. And people are trying to address it. They're trying to come up with things like triple bottom line accounting and so on and so forth that says that we need to look at the economics of this from a multidimensional analysis. We need to look at the economics of it from a human cost, from a monetary cost, from a community cost, from an environmental cost. And so as I've taught economics as part of the PDC, as part of permaculture, as what I'm approaching in this book, I say, you know, we need to move away from a single-dimensional monetary economic model that says that the only part of economics is the monetary system, that is the cash flow system and so forth. And we need to say that we, in order to encompass all these dimensions, we really need to look at it as what I would call a four-tiered system of economics. And the bottom tier, tier one, are the ecosystem services of the planet. Really, everything that we work with comes out of the ecosystem services of the planet. We are using the resource flows, the energy flows, the information flows of the planet in everything we're doing. And therefore, you can't have something that is modeled economically, that has a valid economic model that ignores that fact. And the thing is, if you go back and do a study of the economic systems that we are using today, which I really have, you realize that when they were created in a time when humans were using a small fraction of the ecosystem services of the planet. You know, compared to everything that was available, humans were using this much. And so they basically considered ecosystem services to be, for all practical purposes, infinite. And at the moment they did that, it wasn't a bad assumption. Compared to what was available, you could get by with that. And it kind of sort of worked, you know. That also at that point in time, they were trying to figure out ways to take advantage of all those resources that were out there and grow, right? So they created an economic model that basically said, Earth's resources are infinite, and we want an economic system that grows. The problem is we still have that. But we now are at a point where we are using more of the Earth's resources than the Earth can regenerate. And so a model that says that you can ignore the finite nature of Earth's resources, and that says that the only way to have an economy that functions is for it to grow exponentially forever, that becomes a liability. And it is a liability at this point in time. So we have to remodel our economic systems around the Earth's ecosystem and its ecosystem services as being tier one, the foundation, right? And then tier two becomes the goods and services that we as human beings generate off of that. And for a long time, there was no monetary system. There was no money system. People figured out ways of exchanging value, gift economies, other kinds of economies that only had layer one and layer two, right? Tier one, tier two. It was just people creating value, services, goods, food, so forth, shelter, out of tier 1. Then later on, we added tier 3. And we need to understand that tier 3 is dependent upon and is supposed to allow us to have efficient ways of exchanging all of the goods and services created in tier 2, right? And when I teach the whole model, I go to tier 4, which is there are things like credit default swaps and other fiduciary instruments that allow you to make money by manipulating the flow of layer 3, right? So if you want to look at it, that's kind of a real, if you want to model the whole thing, you got to go there, right? And I don't know how you can make something economic that doesn't model all of that and say we need to do a multi-dimensional economic analysis. We have to be profitable in the money flow, because if we're not, then we're not going to have a resilient system. But we also have to be profitable in tier 1 and tier 2. We have to be regenerating the Earth's resources. We need to be working that as part of our economic model, right? And we need to be obtaining a yield, as well as Holgram said, you know, a practical yield out of our systems. And if we're not doing that, we're not economic. So to me, that statement of our systems need to be economic has all those layers to it.
Yeah, excellent description. And I really like the focusing on the profit, because a lot of people are saying profit's a bad word. And I don't think profit's a bad word at all. I think it's a very good word. But it is misused a lot or mispracticed. So I guess the core is how do you convince people that it's beneficial to be profitable in the first two, the foundation layers 1 and 2, and that's, if you get them excited about that, it gives them a motivation. What's the motivation to going with these two tiers to find profit in that instead of just exploitation?
Absolutely. And that's part of the challenge I've had in trying to figure out how to write the opening sections of this book, because what I'm really trying to do is make an argument for the purposes of this book, what I'm going to define as good design. You know, good design is design that meets certain criteria, and I'm going to argue that there's a reason that you should be looking at that and doing that. And we have, in order to do that, there's parts of the conversation that have come up, like externalized costs, right? A lot of companies today, there's been some good research from people who said that almost every one of the top industries on the planet today would be unprofitable if they had to pay for the externalized costs that they are generating, okay? And for those who aren't familiar with that economic term, an externalized cost is a cost that if you're running a company, you can push off onto somebody else. In other words, you can make it external to your accounting system. So, you know, if you are a agribusiness company and you can dump toxic gick all over the place, to use Paul's term for it, and not have to pay for the consequences of that, that's a cost you've externalized. The problem is that we've now made this such a common thing that all of us are having to bear huge amounts of externalized costs. We have gotten to the point where there are so many companies out there throwing externalized costs around that they are being drowned in the externalized costs of all the other companies doing the same thing. And so there is no way that I'm aware of that we can create a resilient system for human habitation in which we let everybody just willy-nilly go out there and externalize every cost they possibly can. And because of that, if you know, what ends up happening is you do the cost-benefit analysis and you realize that we're getting to a point in history where that's not a viable business plan any longer. And companies are starting to realize that. And society is starting to realize that. And so the way that you get people to think about this is to realize that to be members of the corporate community, members of the community that are valuable, that are doing good for the community and for the families that are being, you know, that you're serving, including your own family, that we're going to have to address this. And therefore, I like to talk about what I call win-win designs instead of win-lose designs. To me, when you externalize costs, you're going for a win-lose design, which is I win, you lose. And to me, that's not economic over the long term. With more thought and a little more insight into the design process, we can look for the capability of win-win, which is I can do this, I can make a profit, but at the same time, I can do it in a way that's ethical, that also benefits the people that I'm serving. That's a win-win. And what I'm going to argue is that we need to be figuring out how to teach our designers that are creating the larger scale systems that are supporting our cities and everything else, how to think in terms of those win-win designs instead of win-lose designs.
I see a fundamental issue with this in that we're not allowing companies to think like this because of the structure that they're within. And so, for example, with government, we have unfunded liabilities. They're doing the same thing. They're pushing off these responsibilities to the future where they don't have to worry about it until it comes crashing down on them.
Right.
And with that system, so that we have that system, and then we have all these companies within that system, how can we expect companies to realize the faults if the system they're in is saying this is the way to do it? And
absolutely. And I think that again, one of the things I like to say is engineers that have been practicing engineers for a while are very practical people, right? You're not going to get a magic switch to flip and have everybody change. In everything like this, there's always what I call the S-curve of adoption. It's something I teach about in the PDC, where you have a few people who model it in the beginning and show it's possible, and then you have the people who are the first followers, and you have the early adopters, and then eventually people start to see it and go, that actually works. And so what we have to do right now is we're in the place where we have to do proofs of concept and pilot projects and show that this can work. But we also have to start, because a lot of people won't do it until they can see it. There are people who you can explain, like, Paul or I or somebody can get up there and give it, explain something and lay it out in words, and there's a certain very small percent of people who will get excited and go off and try it. But the vast majority of people won't try it and won't go and do it until they can see it. So what we need to do at this point is concentrate on the people who are the early adopters and get models on the ground that show this is possible. Second thing I would say to that is something that I'm, one of my catchphrases when I'm teaching a PDC or anything else permaculture-wise is be careful what you incentivize because you will get more of it. Okay? Be careful what you incentivize because you will get more of it. And, I've done a class for some people who were, they were very much a group of people who were like, oh, corporations are all evil and da-da-da and so forth. And so I did a class for them called The Problem of Emergent Evil. And my what I was arguing there was, I've worked in a lot and for a lot of these Fortune 500 companies. I worked around in these places. I've worked with a lot of these people who are the movers and shakers and so forth. And a lot of the people who want to blame the corporations for everything that's going on right now, they think that if you could go into the boardroom, that you would, that they would have all of the curtains drawn, and you have the evil people with, doing this with their hands and figuring out how they could destroy the world. And the thing is, if you go in and you meet these people, they're nice people. They don't have an evil agenda. They're not trying to destroy the world. What happens is we've created a system of incentives that basically incentivizes certain behavior, and the things that emerge out of that turn out to be pretty nasty. Okay? And we're not going to fix that until we fix the incentive system. And so that's a long-term strategy we have to know. It really helps to stop thinking, as much as, I hate some of the things that companies like Monsanto are doing, I'm sure there are people who are running Monsanto that are really nice people that think they're doing some really awesome stuff. you know, and the system that they're working in incentivizes certain things that they're doing. And as long as that system of incentives stays there, it's going to be really hard to change that underlying structure. So, you know, I think that's one of our strategic questions right there, right? How do we get to the point where we begin to change what people think about and actually instantiate the incentives?
Absolutely.
Okay, I gotta jump in. I've been quiet a long time here, giving everybody a chance to say stuff. All right.
I was like, I know there's. I said.
Are you baiting me?
There's no way Paul is going to be able to resist jumping on that.
All right. So here's the thing. If everybody in the world stopped consuming Monsanto products,
Yes.
you would have exactly what you wish for. And so then you're saying incentivizing, and I think what you're suggesting that most people are hearing, like, we got to write to our government, tell them that they're doing it all wrong. And no, I'm thinking that vote with your fork.
Yep.
And it's like, if you hate what Monsanto's doing, spit out that Oreo. What the hell is wrong with you? And it's like, I mean, so much of the book that I'm working on right now is all about the people that are like, I hate that fracking. And it's like, how do you heat your home? Well, with natural gas, it's really cheap.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And of course, I'm pushing a rocket mass heater. And it's like, no, I don't want to do that because I just haven't like looked it up on Google yet. And I don't want to. I've got to go and be at the rally for, you know, against fracking. I don't have time to Google something on the way or anything. So, and it's like this whole mentality, I hate the Monsanto, and they're munching on the Oreos. And it's like, you don't see the connection there. And it's kind of like, so I think what we got to do is we got to each clean up our own fucking house. You got to practice what you preach first. And then on top of that, if your next door neighbor has Oreos in their mouth, then it's kind of like, I got to do something so good here that my neighbor would rather eat my zucchini than eat the Oreos, which I got to think like apple. Got to eat my apple. Would rather eat my apple than eat the Oreos. I think zucchini would be a hard sell. But Josh says, make a better Oreo. And it's like, really, that's honestly the solution, is that we've got to come up with solutions that are more attractive than Monsanto. And I'm working as hard as I can on doing exactly that. And I feel like my podcasts and my Paul Newman made a big difference. That's right. Ben is pointing that out. And so I feel like I'm trying to convey this information, but it's like, it's either like we've talked in the past about, you know, level 1 people cannot hear level 5 stuff. Right. It's like, it seems crazy. And I kind of feel like a lot of my stuff is kind of level 5. So at level 1, people love those fucking light bulbs. And it's like, it takes until level 4 until we can finally slap that light bulb out of their hand. And they're finally like, what am I doing holding this light bulb? It's not until level 4 that they actually understand that those light bulbs that they were loving on in level 1 are making things worse. Yeah. And so and I kind of feel like we've got to share these little tidbits of information. And I don't know, so now I'm getting on a whole new rant, but it's actually a rant I've shared on the Smackdown 100 times before. I am so frustrated. I try to share the information, and it kind of like seems like it just doesn't go very far. But I think part of it is that it's like the stuff I'm sharing is for level 5. And by definition, there's 10,000 times fewer people at level 5 than there are at level 1. So my stuff is basically indigestible by the masses. So I'm trying to find bits that I can share with the masses. And it's been challenging. So when we're talking about de-incentivizing, I think that it's all about vote with your fork. And as long as people keep buying Oreos, that's a sign that we need to make the better Oreo.
Yep.
I think that vote with your fork is definitely a good plan. However, there are some issues with it in that sometimes we're forced to fork. So one of the big strong incentives for companies is being paid to do things, right? So the company or the government will subsidize a company to do something because they're not getting enough people buying with the fork. And so they're forcing people to buy with the fork. And this is where community comes in and becomes so important to me, in that we can change that system by voting with our fork by saying, nope, we're going to do our own thing that doesn't force us to do these other.
Well, I think another thing is that let's take a good look at how there are organizations that are being subsidized, and it's like the oil industry is being subsidized. Corn is so heavily subsidized. And in fact, something that I'm not sure I've said in the Smackdown, but I've said it in podcasts and a bunch of other places, is the whole thing where I want to clearly state, and this has been put into a meme and gone all over the place, I want to clearly state that if you take away the Chem Ag subsidy and the organic ag penalty, the consumer will discover that Chem Ag food costs 4 times more than organic. And I beg you to fucking challenge me on that, because I've got the numbers. In fact, any dumb fuck with access to Google can look it up in 11 seconds flat. So it's like, this is not a big challenge. Anybody asking for proof of the numbers is proving, they're standing up, waving their hand like an idiot to prove that they're an idiot. So it's like, it's so quick and simple to look up. It's a profound difference. So it's like, okay, you know what? Challenge accepted. We can take this on. We can do that. We can do better. We can beat them even with the subsidies. Even though they're subsidized to the gills, we can do better. And if nothing else, just look at cancer. It's like, you want to, because putting all those Oreos in your mouth is giving you the cancer. Of course, it's not fucking labeled that way. Maybe that's something that ought to change, but you know, we can get the word out. And have you priced cancer lately? I mean, I think that it turns out that your Chem Ag food is costing you a hell of a lot more than whatever you're spending at the grocery store.
So Paul, I was about to poke you and say, I think your numbers are inaccurate because I don't think you've included all of the externalized costs of Chem Ag.
Okay, very good point.
You included all the externalized costs. You got there by talking about cancer, which is one of the externalized costs, right?
Sure.
There's the environmental externalized costs. There are a lot of other externalized costs for Chem Ag. And so this is one of the things. So what we've done is we've created a regulatory structure that has incentivized Chem Ag. It's subsidized it. It's incentivized it. It's allowed them to externalize all these costs. And as a result, when you incentivize it that way, you're going to get more of it. So to me, that's a general rule. When you incentivize something, you're going to get more of it. We need to be incentivizing companies to do good stuff by incentivizing them by voting with our fork. We need to recognize that we have government institutions that are fighting against that by incentivizing stuff that's crazy.
Or too big to fail. We're going to bail them out. Like if Monsanto, nobody starts voting with their fork and stops eating the Monsanto food, government steps in and says, they're too big to fail. Our whole food industry relies on them.
Yes. So, this is where we've got to really, this is part of the strategic thinking we've got to go through, which is, that's where we come back to that S-curve of adoption. I was thinking about that when Paul was talking to people who are at level 5 and so forth. If you've never seen the S-curve of adoption, what it basically says is that uptake of anything new in culture has this very interesting curve to it. It starts off really slow, and it goes slow, and you get the early adopters and so forth, until typically it's somewhere around 12 to 13% adoption. It goes boop, and it knees up, and it just takes off. And so where we are is we're fighting in that early part of the curve. And what's going to happen is that the people we're talking to are the kinds of people who are willing to be early adopters or in that first section. That's the people who are going to get what we're talking about here, And
they're the people that are going to benefit the most from being on that curve at that time.
Yes. As they start to do stuff, even if it's more level 2, level 3 kind of stuff, people around them are going to see it, and that's what starts to build. And that's why around 12 or 13%, you get sort of a knee in the curve, and then all of a sudden the adoption rate tends to go way up. And so we're definitely fighting that. And we have to be in the strategy of talking to and realizing that's our audience at this point in time, are the people who are willing to think about these things and analyze these things and make changes at some level. That's the people who are getting it right now and are excited about this. And I feel like we're getting closer. We're getting to that point where I think we're going to accelerate a little bit, because we're getting to the point where the externalized costs for doing all this crazy is high enough that people are starting to scratch their head and go, what's going on here? You know, why is it that we've gone to the point where we have 1 in 60 of our kids now have autistic spectrum disorder? You know, whereas when I was growing up, it was like 1 in 2,000. And, you know, why is it that all these things are just exploding all of a sudden? Is this, you know, what was Salatin's book's title was what? Folks, this ain't normal. And, you know, and I think that's it. It's so many things are starting to blow up in our face. We've done some of this stuff stupid for so long that an increasing sliver of people are starting to ask questions. And that's our audience. Those people who are willing to look at it, open to the possibility of changing things. And that's going to be our fight to get up to a critical tipping point.
So a lot of what we've been talking about today is kind of stuff that is covered in like
there goes his internet again.
PDC. There's a ton more that we're going to be talking about. Oh, fuck. There's a ton more to talk about, and I hope we didn't bore people with the economics. But there's, could you end this, or because we're closing out on time, Allan, in just some quick examples of other things that we're going to get into deep discussions about, examples of areas where regenerative engineering applies to the homestead. What topics are we going to talk about? Yeah,
one of the things to me that's really exciting is, you know, there's been a lot of really great science and engineering advances since Mollison wrote the Designer's Manual. You know, it's an amazing book. Still today, you can go back and look at that and go, there's been a lot of really amazing thought in this book. There's a lot. It's one of those books that you kind of look at and go, read a few pages and stop and think about it, right? But there are some areas in which there's been tremendous strides made since then. For example, soil science, mycology, our understanding of all of that has really just, you know, increased amazingly. There's been some great research and so forth. And so we're definitely going to hit that pretty hard. We're going to be going all the way through to getting out the microscopes and doing soil microscopy and talking about the soil biology and that sort of stuff. So we're going to get into that, and you're going to get some great hands-on that in this class. Another thing to me that's really interesting is that you know, Mollison in the pattern, you know, in the pattern chapter in the Designer's Manual, he did a great job of trying to lay a foundation. But wow, all of a sudden, right after he wrote that book, complexity science and so forth popped up, and there's a lot of understanding now about how ecosystems work and about things like emergent properties in ecosystems and so forth, that when you look at them, they really inform how to work with these complex ecosystems that happen in homesteads and even in a backyard garden, you know. And so I've had a lot of fun thinking about how to take some of the really great insights that come out of that and distill it down, make it really practical, so that when we talk about it, you can come out of it and understand, wow, what I'm doing when I'm working in a homestead is I'm working with this thing that scientists call a complex adaptive system. It's actually what's called an ecological complex adaptive system. It has living elements in it, and they have all these interrelationships. And I can work with that, and if I work with that intelligently, they partner with me in really amazing ways. And we can, you know, you're not getting energy for free, because as an engineer you'd never say that. But what you get is when you partner with that instead of fight with that, then the results can be pretty amazing. And a lot of the traditional design stuff that I was taught in engineering school is fighting with it. not embracing it. It's trying to make it behave the way we want it to behave. And so something else that we're really going to look at here is, hey, let's look at how to embrace the complexity of these ecological systems we're working with, and understand how that we can get huge yield out of these systems if we work with them instead of fight with them. And I think that's another really fun thing. And the pattern understanding on how to do that, really great. Having a lot of fun working on that. And yes, Paul, one of the other books I'm working on is on patterns.
Ah.
Yes. Yes.
I want to write the introduction.
Oh, no.
It's like it'll be like an introduction for Bakananism. All of the following truths are shameless lies.
Thank you very much, Allan Booker, everybody. Go to richsoil.com/pdc.jsp or just search Rich Soil PDC, and you will see Allan's bio there with links to the Elderbridge Institute website if you want to find out more. It was great talking with you, Allan. Hey, if you are a Patreon supporter or a student of the Perma Ethos, you are in our special chat room, and we're going to stick around after the show and talk a little bit more with Allan. So hang in there, and everybody else, goodbye, and thank you once again very much, Mr. Booker.
Bye.